Her fingers snapped the white collar into place, 1953, and just like that, the plain navy dress became something else entirely. She had spent 11 cents on that collar. The question nobody is asking is how she always looked like she spent a fortune. To understand what these women were working with, you have to sit inside the numbers for a moment. The median American household income in 1950 was roughly $3,300 a year. That is the entire household, not just one person's salary. And into that tight budget landed one of the most expensive fashion silhouettes in modern history, arriving straight from Paris and demanding to be replicated in living rooms across the country. Christian Dior unveiled his new look in 1947, and it swept through American culture like a tide that nobody could stop. The silhouette was breathtaking. A nipped waist pulled impossibly small, a full skirt that swept outward and downward, structured shoulders, and a hem that grazed the mid-calf. To construct one of those dresses properly required between 15 and 50 yards of fabric. 50 yards for a single dress. On a $3,300 annual income, that was not a fashion choice, it was a financial event. That gap between what Parisian couture looked like in the magazines and what was actually hanging in a homemaker's closet in Ohio or Tennessee or Iowa was enormous. But here is the thing about a gap that wide. It does not just produce frustration, it produces ingenuity. American women in the early 1950s looked at that impossible silhouette and did not give up. They got quiet, and they got creative, and they built an entire hidden culture of strategy around making the gap disappear. And that is really the thesis of everything we are going to talk about today. These women did not buy elegance. They built it. Through habit, through maintenance, through a set of quiet daily strategies that were passed from mother to daughter without ever being written into any official guide. The budget was not the obstacle. The budget was the teacher. And what it taught them is something that a lot of us have genuinely forgotten. Let me correct something right now, because this misconception is everywhere. When people picture a 1950s housewife's closet, they imagine it overflowing with pastel shirtwaists, a dozen poodle skirts in every color, maybe a few crinolines stuffed in the back. That image is almost entirely wrong. The real quintessential homemaker of that era was, by today's standards, a radical minimalist. She owned fewer garments than most modern women carry in a single season. But every single piece fit her body as though it had been made for her specifically. What these women were practicing, without ever calling it by name, was the original capsule wardrobe. Every piece they owned was chosen because it worked with everything else they owned. Nothing was an impulse buy. Nothing was disposable. Each garment was expected to last years, not seasons, and to earn its place in that small closet by doing more than one job. A skirt that only worked with one blouse was a skirt that did not justify the hanger space it occupied. The word fit meant something very specific to a 1950s woman, and it means something almost entirely different to us now. For her, a garment that fit was one that followed the actual contours of her body without pulling, without gaping, without bunching at the waist or drooping at the shoulder. If it did not fit that precisely, it went to a seamstress or it went back to the pattern table. Fast fashion has trained us to accept approximate fit as normal. These women would have found that genuinely baffling. Now, here is another misconception worth clearing up, because the poodle skirt has done a tremendous amount of damage to how we picture this era. The poodle skirt was a teenage trend. It was worn by high school girls at sock hops, and it had essentially nothing to do with the daily wardrobe of an adult homemaker. The true daily uniform of the 1950s housewife was the shirtwaist dress, button front from collar to hem, practical enough to work in and structured enough to receive company without changing. The shirtwaist worked for a very specific set of reasons that had nothing to do with luck or fashion trend. The button front construction meant it was easy to put on and take off without disturbing a carefully set hairstyle. The collar gave it formality. The full-length button placket meant the waist could be defined precisely with a belt, pulling the silhouette into that coveted hourglass shape without a single structural alteration. It was a dress that did the work of 3 different outfits, depending on what you belted it with and what collar you snapped on. For the adult homemaker who wanted something a little more sophisticated than the shirtwaist for certain occasions, the pencil skirt was the answer. Not the poodle skirt, not the full circle skirt. The pencil. It was narrow, it was structured, and it communicated a kind of composed maturity that the fuller skirts simply did not. Paired with a tucked-in blouse and a single strand of pearls, a well-fitted pencil skirt in charcoal or navy achieved a level of quiet elegance that cost almost nothing to maintain once you had it. Sunday evenings had a particular ritual in many households that almost nobody talks about anymore. A woman would lay out her core pieces on the bed: the navy dress, the gray skirt, the camel cardigan, the 2 blouses, and she would plan the week. Not just Monday, the whole week. She would decide which collar went with which day, which belt changed the mood of which dress, which scarf transformed the cardigan into something that could go to church and then to the grocery store without anyone noticing it was the same garment. The wardrobe math of this era is genuinely impressive when you slow down and look at it. One tailored wool suit, say a charcoal jacket with a matching skirt, could be worn 3 days a week without anyone noticing because the accessories changed so completely each time. Monday, it appeared with a white blouse, pearl earrings, and white gloves. Wednesday, it came back with a silk scarf tucked at the neck and dark leather gloves. Friday, it transformed again with a contrast color belt and a brooch at the lapel. Same suit, 3 entirely different impressions. This was not accidental. Department store budget guides from the early 1950s actually formalized this approach in print, advising women to allocate up to 20% of their entire clothing budget to accessories alone. 20%. Not to new dresses, not to new shoes, to gloves, belts, and scarves. The reasoning was explicit. A well-chosen accessory multiplied the usefulness of every garment you already owned. It was investment thinking applied to a household closet, and it worked with mathematical precision. Gloves, belts, and scarves were the engine of variety in a 1950s wardrobe, and they deserve far more credit than they typically receive. A silk scarf could be worn at the neck, tied at the wrist, knotted on a handbag handle, or wrapped around a hat brim. A belt could define a waist, change the proportions of a dress, or transform a cardigan into a structured jacket silhouette. White gloves communicated formality. Dark gloves shifted the same outfit toward something more serious and polished. These were not decorative afterthoughts. They were the mechanism. Picture this scene. It is 10 o'clock at night in a small kitchen in 1953. The dinner dishes are done, the children are in bed, and a woman is standing at the sink with a bar of ivory soap and a single white piqué collar in her hands. She washes it carefully, works out the day's wear, rinses it twice under cold water, and lays it flat on a clean dish towel. Tomorrow morning, starched and dry, it will snap back onto the navy dress and look as though it just came from the laundry. This happened every night. It was as automatic as locking the door. The detachable collar system is one of the most elegant budget strategies of the entire decade, and it has been almost completely forgotten. Here is how it worked in practice. A woman owned one foundational dress, typically navy or black, a color that read as formal without drawing attention to itself. And then she owned 5, sometimes 6, detachable collars in different styles and fabrics. Each collar snapped or buttoned on in under a minute. Each one created a completely different impression. The dress was the constant. The collar was the variable. The collar you chose was not arbitrary. Each style sent a specific social signal that women of that era read fluently, the way we might read a font or a color choice today. The white piqué collar was crisp and professional, appropriate for running errands or meeting with the school principal. The lace collar softened the dress into something suitable for a church luncheon or a neighbor's afternoon visit. The Peter Pan collar in cream was youthful and friendly, the choice for a casual Tuesday. These distinctions mattered. They were a form of communication that required no words. They never wrote it down, but every woman knew. The collar was changed the way a signature is changed, deliberately with intention, because the impression it created was a choice, not an accident. There was no manual for this, no magazine spread that laid out the social grammar of the detachable collar. It was transmitted in kitchens and sewing rooms and across back fences, one woman to another over years. The knowledge lived in hands and habits, not in print. And when the generation that carried it stopped passing it forward, it simply vanished. Starching the collar was a specific ritual, and it is worth describing because the result it produced was remarkable. After washing, the collar was dipped into a light starch solution made from a box of Argo starch dissolved in water, a product that cost pennies and was in virtually every post-war kitchen. The collar was worked through the solution, squeezed gently, shaped by hand, and laid flat to dry. When it came off the drying surface in the morning, it held its shape with a rigidity and brightness that made a 50-cent piece of fabric look, without exaggeration, like it came from a department store display case. Here is the thing that modern fashion culture has almost completely erased from memory. In the 1950s, the condition of a garment was the elegance, not the garment itself. A woman wearing a $3 cotton dress that was perfectly pressed, perfectly fitted, and perfectly maintained looked more put together than her neighbor in an expensive frock with a sagging hem and a loose button at the waist. The price tag was invisible. The upkeep was everything. Think about what that actually required. A cheap cotton dress that looked richer than an expensive one did not happen by accident. It happened because every morning before that dress left the hanger, someone had checked it. Checked the hem, checked the buttons, checked the collar. And if something was off, even slightly off, it was fixed before the dress was worn. The maintenance was invisible to the outside world, but it was the entire foundation of the impression being made. The steam iron was not a weekly appliance pulled out for special occasions. In a well-run 1950s household, it was a daily tool, as routine as the percolator on the stove. A razor-sharp crease pressed into a cotton sleeve or a trouser leg was not just neat, it was a statement. It said, "This woman pays attention." It said, "Nothing in this house is left to chance." The iron was how a homemaker signed her name on the day before it even began. Picture it. The kitchen, 1954. The linoleum is cool underfoot. The rest of the house is quiet. And there is that sound, the long, slow hiss of steam meeting cotton as she draws the iron in a single, deliberate stroke down the length of a collar. She is not rushing. She is not distracted. This is not a chore she is trying to finish. This is the moment she is building the version of herself the world will see today. And she is doing it with complete intention. And mending. Let us talk about mending, because this is where the 1950s standard of elegance becomes genuinely demanding by any modern measure. A missing button was not a minor inconvenience to be ignored until the weekend. It was considered a visible failure of care, a crack in the presentation that told the world something had slipped. A dropped hem, a loose seam, a fraying cuff. These were not bad luck. They were signals that attention had wandered, and a well-kept woman did not let attention wander. Which is why the sewing basket lived on the kitchen counter, not in a closet, not in a drawer, not put away somewhere sensible. It sat out in the open, always accessible, because it was used almost every single day. A loose thread on a collar before school drop-off. A button threatening to give way before a church visit. The basket was there the way a first aid kit is there, because the need was that regular and the response needed to be that immediate. Putting it away would have meant things went unmended. Now here is where the story takes a turn that most people do not expect when they think about 1950s fashion. Because all of this maintenance, all of this pressing and mending and starching was only half the strategy. The other half was home sewing. And in the early 1950s, home sewing was not a hobby or a pastime. It was a serious economic tool that allowed ordinary women to close the gap between their kitchen table and the department store window, one pattern piece at a time. Simplicity and McCall's patterns were the tools that made this possible, and the numbers are worth sitting with for a moment. A single pattern cost between 25 and 50 cents. A few yards of cotton yardage might run another $3. For roughly $4 total, a resourceful homemaker could recreate a dress that would have cost $40 at a department store. That is a 10-to-1 ratio. That is not a small savings. That is an entirely different relationship with clothing, built on skill rather than spending. Reading a pattern envelope in the 1950s was its own quiet skill set. A woman standing at the fabric counter did not just look at the picture on the front. She read the back panel the way a contractor reads a blueprint. Yardage requirements for her size, suggested fabric types, notions needed, meaning the buttons, the zipper, the interfacing. And then she made substitutions based on what was available and what was affordable, adjusting the design in her head before she ever cut a single piece of fabric. There is a direct line worth drawing here, from the wartime discipline that shaped these women to the post-war ingenuity that defined them. The World War II make-do-and-mend mentality did not simply evaporate when the war ended, it transformed. In the late 1940s and into the early 1950s, it became something more ambitious. Not just making do, but making do and elevating. The same hands that had repaired and rationed during the war years were now using those exact skills to reach towards something beautiful. Fabric selection was a skill that took years to develop and was passed between women the way recipes were passed, quietly, practically, with a demonstration rather than an explanation. Choosing the right cotton yardage to mimic the drape of a Parisian original required understanding how fabric moved, how it held a press, how it would behave at the waist when belted. A woman who knew fabric could walk into a store with $4 and walk out with the raw material for something genuinely elegant. Picture her at the fabric counter, 1952. She has already done the math at home. She knows her measurements. She knows the pattern number. She knows exactly how many yards she needs, and she knows which fabric weight will behave the way she needs it to behave. She runs the cotton between her fingers, not casually but with real purpose, feeling for the thread count, for how it responds to the slight tension of her grip. She is not shopping. She is engineering. Then 1952 brought something genuinely new to the fabric counter. Orlon, an acrylic fiber developed by DuPont, hit the mass market and was marketed directly to budget-conscious women as a cashmere substitute. And for the first time, the soft-fitted, cinched-waist sweater look that had been a luxury item became something a homemaker could actually afford to own. Orlon was machine washable, held its shape, and cost a fraction of what real cashmere demanded. The department stores pushed it hard and women responded. The fitted sweater with a cinched waist was one of the decade's most powerful silhouettes, and Orlon made it accessible to women who could not afford cashmere and could not afford the dry cleaning bills that came with it. An Orlon sweater could be hand-washed in the kitchen sink and blocked flat to dry overnight. No dry cleaner, no special handling, no added expense. The hourglass shape that defined 1950s elegance was suddenly available at a working household budget, and women knew exactly what to do with it. Orlon was not alone. Dacron polyester arrived in the same window, roughly 1952 to 1954, and with it came the phrase that would define the decade's relationship with fabric: wash and wear. A Dacron blouse could be washed, hung, and worn again with almost no ironing required. For a homemaker managing a household without domestic help, this was not a small convenience. It was a genuine shift in how much time and money pristine presentation actually required, and women adopted it with real enthusiasm. It is worth pausing here because there is a tendency to look back at synthetic fabrics from this era with a kind of condescension, as if they were a cheap shortcut taken by women who could not afford better. That reading misses the point entirely. For a working-class homemaker in 1953, Dacron and Orlon were genuinely revolutionary. They did not replace quality. They replaced the infrastructure of quality: the dry cleaner, the laundress, the full-time domestic help that middle-class elegance had previously required. These fabrics democratized the look. Now here is one of the quietest and most effective tricks in the entire 1950s budget wardrobe, and it is so simple that it almost sounds too easy when you say it out loud. A slightly oversized sweater, a hand-me-down from a sister or a neighbor, or simply one bought a size up because it was on sale, could be completely transformed by a single wide leather belt cinched firmly at the natural waist. The shapeless became shaped, the borrowed became owned. The ordinary became something that turned heads at the church social. Picture the moment. She pulls the sweater from the drawer, and it is a little large, a little shapeless, the kind of thing that in another decade would simply be worn as is and forgotten. But she reaches for the belt, a wide tan leather one with a simple brass buckle, and she threads it through, and she pulls it snug at the smallest point of her waist. And just like that, the sweater has a waist. The silhouette appears from nothing. The whole look shifts. It takes 40 seconds and costs nothing she did not already own. The hourglass silhouette was the defining visual of the entire decade, anchored by Dior's new look from 1947 and held firmly in place through approximately 1956. Every woman understood that the waist was the focal point, the architectural center of the whole look, and the belt was the most democratic tool for achieving it. A $2 leather belt from the Five and Dime could manufacture the same essential shape as a $50 couture dress. The silhouette was the goal, and the belt was the shortcut that nobody advertised but everybody used. Belts deserve far more credit than they have ever received in any conversation about 1950s style, and they receive almost none today. They were the single most powerful budget tool in the post-war wardrobe, the one accessory that could restructure a garment, define a silhouette, and signal intentionality all at once. A woman who understood belts understood that she did not need a new dress. She needed a new arrangement of what she already owned. That is a kind of intelligence that the modern fashion industry has very little interest in teaching you. Here is where most people stop when they talk about 1950s style. They cover the dresses, the patterns, the accessories, and they move on. But there is an entire second wardrobe that the 1950s housewife maintained, and it lived not in her closet but at her vanity table. The nightly grooming routine was not a luxury or an indulgence. It was a calculated budget strategy, as deliberate and as disciplined as anything else she did. Think about the budget logic for a moment. A woman in 1950 might own 3 daytime dresses, a good suit, and a pair of shoes she had been wearing for 2 years. She could not walk into a department store and solve that problem with money she did not have. But she could sit down at her vanity every single night and make sure that when she walked out the door the next morning, every eye in the room went straight to her face, her posture, her presence, and not to the hem she had already mended twice. Picture it this way. It is 10:30 in the evening. The children are in bed. The kitchen has been wiped down. The house has gone quiet in that particular way. A house goes quiet when everyone else is asleep, and a woman finally has a few minutes that belong entirely to herself. She sits down at the vanity. She reaches for the cold cream. The jar is heavy in her hand, thick glass, cool to the touch, and the lid makes a soft sound when she sets it on the wooden surface. This is the moment the real work of elegance begins. The cold cream ritual had a specific sequence, and women learned it from their mothers the way they learned everything else that mattered, by watching and by doing, never from a written instruction. A small amount was worked across the face in slow circular motions, starting at the forehead and moving outward toward the temples and jaw. Then a clean cloth removed it, taking the day's powder and lipstick with it. The skin underneath was left soft and clean in a way that a quick soap and water wash simply did not achieve. It was the foundation the next morning's face was built on. Pond's cold cream was not the only option on the market, but it was the one that sat on vanity tables from Maine to California in the post-war years. The price point was right. It was available at every five and dime and drugstore in America. And the texture, that particular density and weight of it, was something women trusted in a way they did not always trust newer, lighter products. It had been there through the Depression, through the war, and it was still there in 1952, sitting on the same vanity table, unchanged and reliable. Now move from the cold cream to the bobby pins, because the pin curl was the other half of the nightly ritual, and it was just as important to the budget. A salon visit in the early 1950s cost money that a household running on a median income of $3,300 a year genuinely could not afford every week. So a woman learned to do at home what the salon charged for, and she did it in the dark and the quiet after everyone else had gone to sleep. The metallic click of bobby pins being pressed into damp hair was the sound of a woman choosing not to spend money she did not have. The pin curl technique was more precise than it looked from the outside. Hair was divided into sections, each one dampened slightly, then wound flat against the scalp and secured with two crossed bobby pins to hold the curl direction in place. The direction mattered because it determined whether the finished set would wave away from the face or toward it, and a woman who understood her own face shape knew exactly which she needed. Then came the silk scarf, tied over the whole set before she slept, not for decoration but to keep the curls from flattening against the pillow through the night. The economics of DIY hair in the early 1950s were not subtle. A weekly shampoo and set at a salon was a real expense against a tight household budget, and it was the kind of expense that could quietly disappear once a woman had the skill to replicate the result herself. And that is the part worth sitting with for a moment. These women were not cutting corners out of laziness. They were investing time, which they had in place of money, which they did not. The pin curl was a skill. It took practice. And a woman who had mastered it walked out the door on a Tuesday morning looking like she had just come from the salon. There is something I keep coming back to when I research these routines. These women were not performing elegance for a camera or a magazine spread. They were doing this in the quiet hours of the night, alone, in a house that had gone still, for a version of themselves they intended to present the next morning. The attic remembers, even when we forget. The vanity table with its cold cream and its bobby pins and its folded white cloth was not a stage. It was a workshop. And the woman sitting at it was a craftsperson working on the most visible thing she owned. And then there was the red lipstick. If the cold cream and the pin curls were the foundation of the nightly ritual, red lipstick was the single most transformative tool in the entire budget beauty arsenal, and it cost almost nothing. One tube, applied with precision and care, had the power to make a woman in a 3-year-old cotton dress look completely intentional and completely put together. It was not an accent, it was a statement. And every woman who wore it understood exactly what she was communicating before she had said a single word. The way red lipstick was applied in the 1950s was its own small discipline. A woman did not swipe it on and walk out the door. She applied it, then pressed her lips together against a folded square of tissue paper to blot the first layer, removing the excess and setting what remained. Then she applied a second thin layer over the blotted base. The result was a color that lasted, that did not feather at the edges, and that had a clean, deliberate finish you simply do not get from a single rushed application. The blot-and-reapply method was never written in a magazine. It was passed hand to hand. What I want to be careful about here is the word vanity, because it does not mean what the 1950s homemaker understood it to mean. The nightly routine at the vanity table was not about narcissism or self-obsession. It was about discipline. It was about showing up the next day as the most polished, most composed version of yourself you could manage on the resources you actually had. These women understood that their appearance was a daily craft, something practiced and maintained and improved over time, not something purchased and discarded. Now here is one that costs absolutely nothing, and it is possibly the most overlooked tool in the entire 1950s elegance system: posture. The way a woman carried herself through a room was considered as important as anything she was wearing, and the women of that era understood this in a way that has largely evaporated from the culture. A dress cut on the bias, a pencil skirt, a fitted shirtwaist, all of these silhouettes were designed for a body held upright. Slumped shoulders could ruin a $20 dress. Perfect posture could elevate a $4 one. Beyond posture, there were the invisible signals that separated a woman who understood elegance from one who was simply wearing nice clothes. Clean, shaped nails, not necessarily painted, but filed and consistent. Pressed seams that lay flat and did not twist around the leg. A collar that sat perfectly flat against the neckline without curling at the points. A hem that was exactly even all the way around. None of these things cost money. Every single one of them cost attention. And attention, these women understood, was a form of respect for themselves and for the people they were about to walk toward. Shoes were the one category where the 1950s budget wardrobe philosophy shifted slightly. In almost every other area, the strategy was to own less and maintain it better. But with shoes, the emphasis was specifically on quality, even if it meant owning only 2 pairs. 2 good pairs of leather shoes, maintained impeccably, were considered far superior to 10 cheap pairs that wore down at the heel and scuffed along the toe within a season. The shoe was the foundation of the entire silhouette, and a woman who wore a beautiful dress above a pair of run-down shoes had undermined every other effort she had made. The shoe care ritual was as regular and as specific as anything else in the maintenance system. Every evening after wearing, the shoes were wiped down with a soft cloth to remove dust and any surface scuffs before they had a chance to set. A cedar insert was placed inside each shoe to hold the shape and absorb moisture. Heel wear was addressed early, before it reached the point of looking shabby, because a worn heel was visible from behind, and it undid the entire impression of a carefully assembled outfit. The cobbler was not a last resort. He was a regular stop, like the grocery. The handbag followed exactly the same logic as the shoes. One structured bag in a neutral color, treated not as a seasonal accessory to be replaced when the trends shifted, but as an investment piece to be maintained indefinitely. The leather was conditioned. The hardware was kept polished. If a seam began to separate, it went to the repair shop before it became a crisis. A woman might carry the same handbag for 4 or 5 years, and at the end of those years it still looked deliberate and composed because she had never stopped caring for it. The bag was not a trend, it was a tool. The color discipline of the 1950s capsule wardrobe was one of its most quietly brilliant features, and it is the thing modern fast fashion has most completely abandoned. The foundation colors were navy, black, and gray, with 1 or at most 2 accent colors woven through the accessories. Every piece in the wardrobe was chosen to connect to every other piece. Nothing sat alone. Nothing required a specific partner to function. A navy dress worked with the black belt. The gray skirt worked with the navy sweater. The scarf in the accent color pulled everything together. The system was not accidental. It was designed. The reason the neutral foundation worked so well was mathematical. When every garment in the wardrobe coordinates with every other garment, the number of distinct outfits you can build from a small number of pieces multiplies dramatically. A navy skirt, a gray skirt, two blouses, a sweater, and a suit jacket in a neutral tone can produce more combinations than most modern women get from a closet 3 times that size, because in the modern closet, half the pieces cannot talk to each other. The 1950s homemaker understood this intuitively. She built her wardrobe the way an architect builds a structure, from the foundation up. Picture Monday morning in a post-war American home. She is standing at the small wooden table beside the wardrobe, and she has laid out her gloves, her belt, and her scarf in 3 different arrangements. She is not choosing today's outfit. She already decided that last night. She is choosing Tuesday's look at the same time because she has learned that elegance rushed is elegance lost. The woman who grabs whatever is on top of the pile in the morning is the woman who arrives somewhere feeling like she assembled herself in the dark. The woman who planned the night before arrives feeling like herself. She did not grab the outfit in a rushed moment by the door. The night before, she had already decided. The gloves were laid out on the dresser, the belt chosen, the scarf folded just so. This was not fussiness. It was strategy. Planning the next day's look in the quiet of the evening meant nothing was improvised, nothing was wrinkled from a last-minute search through a drawer, and nothing clashed because she had not thought it through. The outfit arrived in the morning already complete. From 1947 through roughly 1956, the wasp waist and the full skirt or pencil silhouette held absolute dominance. Dior had set the standard, and American women, even those working on a fraction of a Parisian budget, had organized their entire wardrobe logic around that cinched hourglass shape. Then, slowly and almost imperceptibly, the silhouette began to breathe. Waistlines softened, hemlines shifted. The rigid architecture of the early decade gave way to something slightly looser, slightly more streamlined, pointing toward what the early 1960s would eventually become. When that silhouette began its slow drift, a woman with a minimal wardrobe faced a real question. Did she discard what she owned and start over? Of course not. She adapted. A full skirt could be taken in. A waistline seam could be let out slightly to follow the new, easier line. A collar could be removed entirely to give a dress a cleaner, more modern shoulder. The same sewing skills that had built the wardrobe now extended its life through the transition. Nothing was thrown away simply because fashion had shifted an inch. The alteration was not a defeat. It was a continuation of the same logic that had governed the wardrobe from the beginning. You did not replace a garment because the world had changed around it. You renegotiated the relationship between the garment and your body, between the garment and the current moment. A woman who could take in a seam, drop a hem, or remove a collar had a wardrobe that was genuinely flexible across years, not just across seasons. That skill, passed from mother to daughter at the kitchen table, was worth more than any department store charge account. Right now, in the summer of 2026, the internet cannot stop talking about looking expensive on a budget, about quiet luxury, about rich-looking outfits that do not require a rich woman's income. Style publications and social media feeds are full of it. And every single piece of advice being offered, the neutral color palette, the minimal closet, the investment in fit over quantity, the focus on condition and maintenance, was already being practiced quietly and without fanfare by a generation of American homemakers who had no other choice and made it look effortless anyway. The exhaustion that modern women feel toward fast fashion, the sense that cheap clothing falls apart before it is paid for, that nothing fits correctly, that the closet is full and there is still nothing to wear, is not a new problem wearing a new face. It is the same problem the post-war housewife was already solving on a median household income of roughly $3,300 a year. She solved it not by spending differently, but by thinking differently. The garment was not a purchase, it was a relationship, and relationships require tending. The argument at the center of everything we have covered today is actually very simple. Elegance in the 1950s was never a purchasing decision. It was a habit decision. The women who looked the most put together were not the ones who spent the most. They were the ones who maintained the most, who planned the most, who treated every collar and every crease and every scuffed heel as something worth attending to before it became a problem. The budget was almost irrelevant. The discipline was everything. That is the part that got lost somewhere between then and now. So, what can actually be borrowed from all of this today? Start with the detachable collar. It costs almost nothing. It snaps or buttons onto whatever you already own, and it changes the entire character of a dress or a blouse in under 30 seconds. Then the belt trick, a wide leather belt over an oversized sweater or an unstructured top manufactures the waist that the garment was not designed to give you. And finally, the nightly maintenance routine. 10 minutes before bed. Check the hem, replace the button, wipe the shoes. These are not chores. They are the actual work of looking elegant. The capsule wardrobe lesson is worth stating one final time, plainly and without decoration. Fewer pieces, each one chosen with care. Each one fitted to the actual body wearing it, not the body on the pattern envelope or the mannequin in the window. Every piece maintained with consistency, mended before the damage spreads, pressed before it is worn, stored properly when it is not. Nothing purchased impulsively, nothing kept out of guilt. The wardrobe as a curated living system rather than an accumulation of individual impulse buys. That is the whole philosophy, and it fits on an index card. Your grandmother knew something they stopped teaching. Not a secret exactly. More like a set of unspoken understandings that passed from woman to woman through observation and repetition rather than instruction. She knew that a pressed collar communicated more than a new dress ever could. She knew that the belt was not an accessory, but an architectural tool. She knew that the 10 minutes she spent at her vanity at night were an investment that paid out every single morning. Nobody handed her a guide. She learned by watching, by doing, and by caring enough to keep doing it when it would have been easier to stop. Here is the thing that I keep coming back to after all of this research. These women were not performing elegance for an audience. They were not dressing for approval or competing with the neighbor's wardrobe. The nightly pin curls happened in an empty kitchen after the house went quiet. The collar was starched whether or not anyone outside the family would see it. The crease was pressed into the sleeve because the sleeve deserved a crease. There was a form of daily self-respect embedded in all of it that had nothing to do with being seen and everything to do with how a woman chose to meet her own day. What gets lost when a generation stops passing these things down is not just the technique. It is the philosophy underneath the technique. When nobody teaches you that the condition of a garment matters more than its price, you spend your whole life buying new things to replace the feeling of care you never received. When nobody shows you that 10 minutes of maintenance prevents 10 months of looking undone, you assume elegance is expensive because you have only ever seen it purchased, never practiced. The unspoken rules are not trivial. They are the load-bearing walls of the whole system. The real legacy of the 1950s budget wardrobe is not the detachable collar or the Orlon sweater, or even the simplicity pattern that turned $4 of cotton into a $40 dress. Those are the tools. The legacy is the discipline that picked up the tools every single day without being asked, the ingenuity that looked at a hand-me-down sweater and saw an hourglass waiting to be found with a $2 belt, and the quiet pride of a woman who knew that what she wore was a reflection of how seriously she took herself. That pride did not require money. It required intention. And intention, as it turns out, is the one thing that has never gone out of style. I would love to know what your mother or grandmother actually used. Not the famous tricks everyone has heard of, but the small, specific ones that lived only in your family. The particular way she folded a scarf, or the brand of starch she swore by, or the one piece of advice she gave you about shoes that you have never forgotten. Leave it in the comments below, because those details are exactly the kind of thing this channel exists to collect before they disappear completely. And if the vanity routine side of all this has you curious, the next video goes deep into the nightly rituals that 1950s women kept at their dressing tables. I will see you there.